'Twas the week between Christmas and New Year's. What do you usually do with this time?
This seems to be a real lazy time.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the cultural norm that we've all finally accepted among each other that
Yeah.
that we don't do anything this week.
Yeah, I
We need to
guess.
keep it up.
Yeah.
I even read an Instagram or a tweet that I shared on my story on Instagram. It says these 6 days between Christmas and New Year's is the only time of year you should strive to do absolutely fucking nothing. Make zero progress. Take all the time off. Go on vacation from your vacation. Be the least impressive version of yourself. Transform into a couch. I'm down with that. How about you?
Being a bachelor homeowner, I've got stuff to do. There
Always
are
projects.
always.
Yeah, I definitely know what you mean. I mean, I had to get up and just pick up, from our Christmas dinner yesterday and
Yep.
and do all of that, maybe get to some laundry. And anyway, great time to be lazy, but a great time as well to be grateful, especially for our friends over at Celestina. Celestina is classical music's wingman. By day, they're world-class performers and studio musicians who played on your favorite films, but by night, they're on a mission to broaden the definition of what classical music was, is, and can be. More on Celestina here in a few minutes, but I wanted to, since we're in between, Christmas and New Year's, it's kind of also a time when holiday music is still acceptable, maybe not preferred, depending on who you are, but
Right.
acceptable. So there's just one thing, one little recap from Christmas I wanted to make sure I shared here on Triloquy. Tell the people, because I'm not the only one who didn't know. Tell the people a little bit about Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas.
Sure. You know, the same studio that did all the Muppets and associated with Sesame Street,
Sure.
all that sort of thing. They put out a Christmas show called Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, done with a combination of puppets, marionettes, and, miniature model camera work.
Yeah. And it's most certainly in that category of American classical music, at least if you ask me.
hmm
Here's my favorite track from it. It's called Ain't No Hole in the Wash Tub.
That's right.
When there ain't no hole in the wash tub. If you look to the good side, falling down's a free ride, slipping and a sliding in the mud.
If your back is hurting, I can say for certain I'll be there to treat you to a soothing back rub.
When there ain't no hole in the wash tub.
What does that mean to you, proverbially speaking? When it ain't no hole in the wash tub, that means when stuff is going okay,
That's right.
things are going okay.
That's right. You've got water in the wash tub, so that means you got work, which means you probably got a little bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
hmm
Was this something that you would say was culturally aligned with your sort of idea of music when, you were watching this growing up? Did you hear the song and hear the music throughout the special and hear yourself or feel, not marketed to, certainly not as a child, but do you think
hmm
they successfully targeted you in the musical production of this, I guess is what I'm asking.
Probably at my age at that point, I would have been more attracted to the fact that they were puppets and marionettes and things like that.
Okay.
So it was cute.
But it
right?
wasn't foreign. Well, they aren't singing
Right.
Italian arias
Right.
at the
And
same
see,
time.
the thing is you talk about it being a classic. I don't remember it catching hold. I think it was played for maybe 3 or 4 years
Mm.
around Christmas. And then probably viewership was low compared to your Charlie Browns and Rudolphs and things like that. I don't remember it really catching on.
A hidden
A
classic.
hidden gem.
Maybe. Yeah. Well, it's in my rotation now. Definitely. Thank you for putting that on my radar. I think about all of these incredible singers and actors who were the voices behind these puppets.
hmm
And it just brings up the conversation that there are so many people who, were famous in music, comedy, acting, who, ended up at least at some point of their career being the voice behind a character. And we learned that this evening about someone who we learned a little bit more about, Scatman Crothers.
hmm
So just for context for people, one of my personal Christmas traditions is to watch The Shining on Christmas Day. Okay. And I know that people think I'm just strange, but in the same way that I love to sort of like nod off to the dog show on Thanksgiving, unless it's getting good, because it was good this year. I feel that way about The Shining. Just, around 4 or 5 p.m. on Christmas Day, you've had something to eat, you've opened presents, you've gotten settled into that notch in the couch. let's cut on The Shining.
So let's turn up the creep factor.
I just love it. Anyway, so Scatman Crothers was Mr. Halloran in The Shining, the cook, the black cook. And I noticed for the first time this year, watching the credits, I actually took the time to see the name of this black man who was, in this film. The first one to die, of course. Going up there trying to help everybody.
He's trying to help.
See, that's what some of us need to learn about this doing good.
He should have stayed down at home with his velvet paintings.
Anyway, I bothered to pay enough attention to the credits to see who Dick Halloran was or who this actor was. So I now know the name Scatman Crothers. I asked you if you were familiar, with any of his music with a first name like Scatman. I figured he had to have been some sort of musician.
Yeah.
Were you familiar with his musical stuff?
Yeah, it's all the old timey vibe. But even now, if you go over to YouTube and search his name, Ain't She Sweet is one of the first things that comes up.
Yeah.
And I don't know much about his life past that. I don't know what his activism was like or anything like that.
Well, as far as, we were talking about being the voice behind characters and different things. He was the voice of Hong Kong Phooey, which
right.
I know existed. That was a little before me, but he was the voice of Scat Cat in Aristocats, which is a classic.
Okay.
I definitely know that film. But as we were sort of going through some of his musical performances on the internet, we sat down and found a collaboration between him and Red Fox.
That's right.
Really, really charming to hear, actually. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
Shut up, 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 shut up. Shooby-doo-boo. Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. Shooby-dooby-doo. You got it, red ticket, baby. Your goodbye. Doom-de-doos and left me with eyes. How can I? Don't deal without. Oh, this is the big one coming up now. You took the best. Tell me no day. So come get the rest of this best. Oh, why not? Why not? Why not take all of me? Oh, yeah.
One of my highlights of the Christmas season was watching Red Fox sing unironically, unjokingly, the Christmas song on one of the episodes of Sanford and Son. So to hear his voice there with Scatman Crothers, it makes me think about the risk of losing this classic American form of music. Maybe they're talking about that in music history at Juilliard and all these conservatories. I don't know. Maybe they are. But just in case they aren't, do you think that we run any risk of losing our memory and appreciation of this squarely American music? We can talk about the way that segregation and Jim Crow back in the day, kept those traditions out of certain classrooms, certain spaces. But we all have access to the internet and all of those things these days. Is it worth a revisit to what that type of jazz was and sounded like?
I worry about that all the time, Garrett, about things being lost. You hear about all these composers with their missing pages and lost movements. And they're supposed to have a catalog that was twice as big, but something happened. All those stories. I worry about it all the time. Even when you talk about moving from one medium to the next, meaning from records to cassettes. When you make that transition, you lose stuff.
Yeah.
And now look at us. Now we're trying to get rid of the CDs because we have all the playlists on our streaming devices, and we're back to buying vinyl.
Yeah.
No, I do. But like you're saying, I do worry about that. And why wouldn't we want to go back and at least spend some time revisiting these classics just to have firm footing on where we're coming from?
Yeah. And I know this podcast is called TRILLOQUY. I'm not trying to be spicy. But the thing is, when I listen to that music, I singularly, squarely hear something that is American classical. I feel like there are Ukrainian and Polish and other sorts of folk songs and folk musics that we can make a case for in our classical programming. We aren't there yet when it comes to this type of cultural music, folk music, this type of classical music.
No, I agree.
I can talk about, and I think justifiably so, the connections between that reality and systemic racism. If we're going to consider that and try to consider other things, are there other things that you can point to as to the barrier that that music has, as far as classical music, as far as it being venerated
Right.
as that,
Right.
as it should be?
Where are we on the timeline? Because you can tell stories about Rodrigo and his music elevated the guitar to the orchestral stage, elevated it from a folk instrument to the orchestral stage. But did it? I mean, are there guitars just sitting there every day now?
You make me think about Piazzolla, dance music becoming concert hall music, becoming
Mm,
classical
hmm.
radio music. So I just hope that, we can't solve this problem in particular today, but I do hope it's something that we can continue to think about more and more, because that's American classical music. That's
Sure.
that's just that. And we have to remember why we don't really know, or we haven't centered that music, and we need to face the facts as to why we're continuing to make that decision. And all of this is wrapped up, in this final week of the year, final week of every year, we have this holiday known as Kwanzaa, where we try to really think about Black centric stuff. We, roll about on the seven principles that go along with the holiday.
Hmm.
And, as we talk about those bridges, taking this American classical music and putting it up on the podium that it deserves, there are means everywhere for different types of communities to really understand and celebrate Blackness in the best way we can, especially through music. A story
Hmm.
that I tell every year, that I'll continue to tell every Kwanzaa season, at least when we're recording Triloquy, is the impact that one of my high school band directors had on me, Paula Turner. Shout out to Paula Turner, also my high school music theory teacher, making the point every holiday program. Remember, we were talking about, if it's going to be a holiday concert, it needs to be that,
Hmm.
if you're not just going to have Christmas music. And anyway,
Right.
so she really, put her foot in her hand, and so to speak, to make that happen by including a piece of music on the holiday programming called Imani. It's a work for band written by Sean O'Laughlin. I don't think Sean O'Laughlin is Black. And if I'm mistaken, please correct me. But I only mention that to say this is someone, Black or not, who took the time to dedicate a piece of music to this very specific holiday as a means of teaching the next generation, teaching band kids. This isn't a work that went on some commission by the New York Philharmonic. This is something that in most of its recordings, you're hearing middle schoolers and maybe high schoolers
Mm.
play this music. And I think that intentionality deserves noting, and is something that I celebrate every year. The recording, of course, that I always share in my content and my Kwanzaa special. Shout out to all the radio stations who took the sound of Kwanzaa this year, my radio special. But the recording that I use is by the Washington Winds. So there
Mm.
is at least one professional recording of it, and it's just one of those tunes I return to each and every year. It's a part of this time of the year, and something that I really appreciate. Here's a little bit of Imani by Sean O'Laughlin. Something for all of the, what was the Hotep's name on
You're asking me.
well, what's the classic TV show, not the Jeffersons, Good Times? Michael, I think his name was Michael on Good Times. So
Mm.
something for the kids, the Black kids who go to school,
Mm.
just all the way ready to just say something about the teacher's music programming or whatever. But we have a music teacher, a composer, a system that created that reality for
Mhm.
me. And for me, it's just it's so special, and it's the pinhole of light, When we talk about decolonizing the ecosystem, even the phrase classical music, we have generations of kids now who have been exposed to music, even within the parameters of band or band programs, music that speaks to something broader, speaks to something different, and something that more people can actually connect to. We're taping this on the first day of Kwanzaa, marked by the principle of umoja, or unity. And when I lit the Kanara earlier this evening, we kind of went around talking about what unity looks like to us. What does unity look like to you?
To me, it's a feeling. It's a feeling of support,
Hmm.
a feeling of connection. Like you have people that believe the same thing you do, and it's not so scary what you're facing if you have somebody with you.
Yeah, I think unity, as I was saying, earlier today, it requires that joint destination. I think it's obvious at this point that many of us, especially in arts advocacy, DEI, those sorts of things, we have various opinions, various varying opinions about how things should happen, how we have dialogue, how we deal with inequities in the field. We all have different opinions on how that should happen. Maybe if that destination is the same, we can figure out the details as we go along. Do you think there's a lack of that part of the conversation, really determining where we're going, and instead arguing more about how we're getting to the place where we haven't even decided we're going yet?
Right. So basically, you're saying we're probably not going to agree on the steps to get to the common goal.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
got it.
So, for example, if we're talking about radio programming, we know my approach, to doing that.
Uh-huh.
Everyone's approach doesn't have to be mine, but I think there has to be an approach. There has to be movement in the direction. Again, when I think about unity being connected to shared a shared aspiration, a shared destination, I think there just has to be movement. And it's hard to have these conversations sometimes when you feel like there are parties, there are individuals, there are institutions who say they want to go there, but have their feet planted, so to speak. You don't see that forward momentum.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about, what the forward momentum that happens behind the scenes, rather in front of the scenes, all day. But I think if we can just unite on moving in a direction toward a place that, we have decided we want to go, when we talk about what programming looks like, what we want audiences to look like, maybe that's a good first step. What do you think? Determining the destination and then figuring out the details along the way?
I feel like I've advocated for this before and gotten lit up for it.
Oh, yeah?
No, saying that, we need people that are working at different levels of things. Not
Mhm.
everybody is in the same spot. Like we said, where are we in the timeline?
Mm-hmm.
Some people are only beginning to open their eyes, and all of this sort of talk is still very accusatory. Like they
Mhm.
feel like they're being so they're being singled out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what you're speaking to is the fact that unity requires trust. If I trust that at your level, you're making some movement forward, then there's nothing to really argue about. We're on the same team and all of that. So I think that unity is just going to require some trust. Trust is not one of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa,
Oh.
but maybe that can be a subcategory of unity. Really doing what we can to develop that trust among each other, so that we have that unity, so that we're all moving in the same direction of decolonizing classical music. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final opus of the year. Let's jump in. I'm Garrett McQueen,
I'm Scott Blankenship.
and this is TRILLOQUY, Opus 180. Thank you so much to everyone who has returned week after week to help us keep this podcast going. We could not do this without your support. Thank you so much. If this is your first time checking out the TRILLOQUY podcast, TRILLOQUY is a show that takes the phrase and the idea, the concept of classical music, and works to decolonize it by approximating that phrase to stories, to pieces of music, and to general dialogue that haven't necessarily been affixed to that phrase, to that culture, but things that we think belong in that pot of what is considered classical music, at least from our perspectives. For more information on the TRILLOQUY podcast, to listen to past opuses, and to contribute to the project, visit our website, TRILLOQUY.org. In addition to your very generous support for TRILLOQUY comes from Celestina. They have all sorts of really incredible programming that also works toward the decolonization of classical music, really renewing and refreshing what that can be. And one of the ways that they do that is through a program that highlights and centers in-person and virtual performances. Well, if you'll go to Celestina's website right now on December 30th, if you're listening to this on the day it comes out, you still have time to potentially check this out. On December 30th, they're doing an old school virtual happy hour that is a Tar watch party and discussion. I have yet to see Tar. There are a lot of people who I owe a conversation about this film.
I
We've
haven't
talked
seen it
about it
either.
on TRILLOQUY, the news stories and things. So maybe during this lazy week, but between now and New Year's, I could take the time to stream that or watch it. But anyway, if you want to be a part of the virtual watch party with Celestina, you still have time. It's going down on Friday, December 30th. You can find more information on that at celestina.org. Huge shout out and thanks to everyone over at Celestina for your continued support of the TRILLOQUY podcast. The one and only VJ Iyer is this week's third movement guest. Looking forward to sharing my conversation that I had with him with y'all. In the finale, we have some end of year reflections that Scott and I are going to explore. But I would say, Scott, we have a pretty juicy first movement this
That's
week
right.
to get into. So let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, we're gonna get started with your accidental. What accidental will you give this story that you're gonna share?
I'm giving this a sharp.
Okay, let's hear it. What do you
Yep.
got?
This is hot off the presses. Ink still wet. This came out earlier this afternoon. I'm reading from the NewYorkTimes.com, NYTimes.com. Pandemic woes lead Met Opera to tap endowment and embrace new work. Facing
What a fucking surprise. Go on.
how the turntables have turned.
I hate to say it. I hope I don't sound ridiculous. I don't know who this man is.
Because I have I and the scores of people out here in the arts field, we just been talking to the brick wall, I guess. Oh, until now, money is on the table, money is being lost, so now we're exploring new operas.
Right. Facing tepid ticket sales, the company will withdraw up to $30 million from its endowment and stage more operas by living composers, which have been outselling the classics. So, first, for those who don't know, an endowment is...
So an endowment is a pot of money that maybe that exists in the corporate world and the financial world. I'm not sure, but as far as nonprofits are concerned, it's the pot of money that sort of serves as the foundation of an organization. Interest or a percentage of the interest is taken out every year or however the schedule is for the organization to sort of help the organization stay afloat. But the point is, you have this piggy bank of money so that you can live and survive as an organization. When you start dipping into that pot, things are going wrong. I think this article says it, but even my understanding is that is a last ditch effort. That is, if there is nothing else you can do. I've heard of nonprofits taking out loans on their endowment, that they pay back. So straight out dipping into it because you need to do something. That's a big deal.
Okay.
That's when people are in trouble.
And they say that the Mets endowment was valued at $306 million. Is that a lot?
I mean, of course, 306 million sounds like a lot to me. I think this article says that for an organization of their size and their stature, that's relatively small.
That is one of the things. They are quoting Peter Gelb near the top here. The challenges are greater than ever. He's referring to trying to remount trying to get a season going again after a pandemic shutdown.
Yeah.
And folks, we have the receipts right here on Triloquy. You can go back and listen to past episodes where we have talked at length about, will this be the moment when arts organizations take the opportunity to chart a new path, or will they go to the canon to try to recoup some money?
Should people not feel a way? And I know that you can't say how people should feel, but is it, I'll say, is it reasonable for people to point out the fact that we're having this conversation because money has come into the conversation? The Met is having to dig into the endowment, so now they're going to try something different. It wasn't because the audiences were looking one kind of way. It's not because community engagement wasn't whatever it needed to be. It's because there was some money at stake. Should we not feel a way? Well, again, you can't tell us how we should feel. Is it fair to point that out? Is it fair to throw that little pebble into the pond?
I'm just sorry to see that some of these organizations are coming around late.
Sure.
Because there were people who have been the canary in the coal mine,
Mm-hmm.
trying to say that, you need to start shifting your business model and tweaking your programming.
Yeah.
But to further quote Peter Gelb, the only path forward is reinvention. Well, on the Triloquy podcast, we've been talking about that for 3-ish years, but nonprofit organizations try to dip into their endowments only as their last resort, as Garrett was saying. This season at the Met, it is turning to the endowment to cover operating expenses to help offset weak ticket sales and a cash shortfall that emerged as some donors were reluctant to accelerate pledged gifts among the stock market downturns. So as more cash gifts materialize, the company hopes to replenish the endowment.
Mm-hmm. The connection between stock market, financier, culture, ecosystems, and the arts may not be what people think about front of mind, when they hear an institution like the Met Opera. I really appreciate that correlation is drawn very clearly here, because what that says to me, as many nonprofits are exploring, the way that funding happens itself has to be different. We have to talk about diversity not only with audience bases, we have to talk about diversity with funding bases. Now,
Yep.
as someone who has spent 30 years fundraising, multiple times a year
Yep.
in a very community on the ground, as close to the ground as a public radio station can get way,
Mm-hmm.
do you have words of encouragement or words of warning for an institution like the Met exploring more community-centric fundraising?
The idea of having a broad base, I believe, is what you need. You want a lot of people giving a little bit of money,
Mm-hmm.
maybe $10 a month. The reason for that is because you're going to lose listeners. They'll die. Their tastes will change. They'll lose hearing for whatever reason.
Sure.
You can come up with all sorts of reasons that people might stop listening to your programming. Refresh my, you wanted to know if I had encouragement so here's the problem. When you have somebody that swoops in with a big check,
Mm-hmm.
it saves that season and the musicians get paid in that, right? But what happens when that pledge is no longer there? You've got a big gaping hole in
Yeah.
your budget now.
Yeah.
So that's why you want a whole bunch of people giving a little bit of money, because if you lose a few there, those holes are usually plugged by new small donations.
Mhm.
That's what I'm saying.
Now, don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
I have done plenty of the public radio pledge drives myself, and it's not all it's not always pretty. I'll say it's not always,
That's right.
so enjoyable. At the same time, there is such a feeling of accomplishment when you do meet that hour's goal or that day's goal, or you're there on day 6 and you just crossed the finish line with what you needed when everyone comes into work on a Saturday or whatever. So
Right.
I think in addition to being a safer, if I'm going to use a word like that, a safer way of doing fundraising, it creates sort of a team effort. I'm also thinking about what it would look like, in public radio. It's the hosts that really are on the front line of talking to the people and asking them to donate or whatever.
It is.
We could do that in opera when it comes to some of these big stars. Shout out and congratulations to Lemmy Pulliam. I don't know if we mentioned that last week. He had his Met debut
Oh, okay,
last
yeah,
week, which
yeah.
which was a huge deal. But if you get your Lemmy Pulliams, if you get Yannick, the conductor of the orchestra, if you get some of the faces of this institution out front in a similar way that public radio hosts solicit. So I almost said solicit for tips, solicit for donations.
Very
that
good.
that could be a thing. And now we're talking about collaborations between public radio stations and the Met, training and best tips, or maybe you dedicate a day of your programming as a radio station to having these people coming in and anyway. I can
Sure,
spit out
sure,
ideas all
sure.
day, but as we're seeing what has been happening, that time has run out. They're
Right.
digging into the endowment. So whatever happens, something needs to happen on the fundraising level.
It says here that while their previous audience base were, they preferred war horses like La Boheme and Aida and Carmen, like that. It says the Met staged more new work in recent years. That dynamic has begun to shift, a change that has grown more pronounced since the pandemic. While attendance has been generally anemic, contemporary works, including Fire Shut Up in My Bones, drew sellout crowds, whereas Verdi's Don Carlo, 40% attendance throughout the performance.
Not only did I get in an airplane and stay in a hotel, I bought a ticket, to go see
Right.
Fire Shut Up on My Bones. I planned to be in New York to see Malcolm X. Shout out to Anthony Davis, member of the TRILLOQUY family. Can't wait to see that. Can't wait to see audience reaction to that because, they were shitting on Malcolm X back in the day, weren't they? And now he's on y'all stage, at least a depiction of what he stood for and the work that he did in his life. So I will definitely be there for that. If that is my impetus to go, I'm sure that's the impetus for many, many more people who, folks who even don't have to get on an airplane, folks who live there in New York, community audience members, potential audience members that, all of a sudden now you have their attention. So as I say, week after week, the new music, the new programming, the contemporary program, I will never, and I can never see that as a risk. I see it as a surefire way to get a new audience at the very least, a renewed audience, and maybe even a broader audience and one that can, help the organization stay afloat financially. I wanted to skip down to the last bit of this article from the New York Times. They've quoted Yannick here in the finale. It says, "I want everyone to feel welcome at the Met. Will they fall in love with every opera we do? Of course not. But I don't want anyone to say the Met is not for me." I'm encouraged by that perspective because, yes, while I think a person can become a fan of an institution, of an organization, and support whatever happens, even if they don't like it, even if they aren't interested, while I do think that is a possibility, I do like the aspiration of having something for somebody, not
Yep.
everything for
Yep.
everybody, but something for everyone. Now, there are certain conversations that we have to have when we really talk about what it looks like to, in a season's time, have something for absolutely anyone. We have to start talking about, from my perspective, the integration of hip hop on the stage, and not in a kitschy way, but in a way that actually engages some of our classic hip hop artists and professionals and academics in the field. We were talking about the jug band Christmas. What does it look like to have some of the blues, or what people call roots, on the Met stage? When you think about what's going to get you, not necessarily on an airplane and a hotel and to New York City, but let's just say generally, you're on a work trip, you're doing a conference or something, and it happens to be in New York, you have time to go to a Met performance. What do you think they need to explore to have you included in that something for everyone?
A syringe of Demerol and a gurney.
Okay, but seriously speaking. But really.
I would go and see. There are some classics that I would go see.
Mhm.
I like Turandot. I'm not ashamed to say it.
Or like Carmen could be interesting to see,
Sure, but there's new
Minus
things
that
coming.
ending.
There's new things coming out. Like Minnesota Opera recently did The Shining.
Oh
you
yeah,
know?
to
So you
pull
would,
us back there.
okay,
Yeah.
so
Shout out to Scatman.
what would it be? What would you get dressed to go and see a Shining opera?
I
Or
mean, I'm gonna
you're already
dress.
gonna
I'm gonna dress how I dress for anything. First of all,
but
but
you've already watched it at home once to celebrate Christmas.
yeah, I mean, but no, I would. I don't know if I would, run and go see The Shining before a Malcolm X or a restaging of
Because,
Fire, but I would
because,
go. I would do it.
because nothing says Christmas like an elevator full of blood. That's right.
For all of the years y'all have tried to push I can't even
Die
Die
Hard.
Hard down my throat as a Christmas movie. Let me have The Shining, okay? I'll let you have The Shining on the opera stage if you let me have it for Christmas, okay?
Sold.
but anyway, you're saying it sounds like what you're saying as far as, being a part of this renewed audience they're looking for is a storyline that is a little more contemporary, maybe something more edgy, something less powdered wiggish and more,
A little more
today.
familiar. A little
Yeah.
more. There's a familiarity there. I want to before we go on, I want to bring in one quote here from Simon Woods, President and Chief Executive Officer of League of American Orchestras. He says the need to build new audiences is more urgent than ever. Do you feel like we're too late? Do you feel like there is still a chance to save an opera season, or what do you the whole company?
Yeah.
Is it possible? Are we too late?
Unfortunately, organizations like the Met are too late when it comes to certain individuals. I definitely would not go as far as to say whole communities, because it's going to be some Latine folks in there. It's going to be some Black folks in there. That's always going to be a thing.
Mhm.
And while I do think that it is too late for some folks through that community sort of, aspect of it, at least you have a chance. If I have a friend who is just not at all interested in an opera, if I say, hey, they're playing The Shining at the Met, and maybe that means if I really care, I have to buy the ticket even, just to get them there. There's that possibility,
Mhm.
So there is, I think retention is the word I was looking for last week when we were talking about return audiences.
Sure,
You know,
sure.
so I think it's one thing to get people, to come for that first time. The more familiar stories and word of mouth, I think, is really how retention and growth is gonna come about. Too late. Not necessarily, but time almost up that as well. I will say. So, all right. Well, we'll have that in the description to get us to our next accidental. I think we'll hear a little excerpt from the opera rendition of The Shining. It's music by Paul Moravich with a libretto by Mark Campbell. Here's a little bit of this opera, The Shining, to get us to our next accidental.
No matter what, shine on.
I'll have to put a bit of my maturity on because I can only imagine, the scene where Jack Nicholson's character is chasing Danny through the hedge maze. What is
Oh,
that,
yeah.
Danny boy?
Oh, no.
Or the, of course, how can you not just stand up and give a round of applause to the operatic "Here's Johnny"?
Oh, sure.
But then maybe, the librettist and the composer have, in this case, tried to move closer to the book and not what people's, sort of expectations will be based on the film. So,
Right,
there's all
right.
kind of creative stuff that can happen there. But anyway, all right. Well, we have one more accidental this week. When we talk about media, first of all, the first thing I'm going to say is that we usually stick to, articles that, come out on various news channels online. But, this week, we have a little something different. Every now and again, something happens on social media that really just, creates some waves, makes this thing called classical music a little more interesting than it typically is. And this week, we definitely got a little bit of that. I want to give a shout out to Babatunde Akimboboye, a member of the TRILLOQUY family and a very outspoken activist, artstivist in the field. So earlier this week on his very successful and very popular social media channels, he posted a video that called out a well-known Black opera singer in the field. Just for context, let's listen to just a little of what Babatunde had to say here about this opera star.
For ourselves. When young Black opera singers started calling out the opera industry for their lack of diversity, he took the opportunity to essentially tell them that it's because they're not putting in the work. Get good enough to get noticed and you won't be so angry. Then you can make a difference. Apparently, some of us that were the most vocal about this equality thing had the least amount of experience or preparation. I'm not sure why that matters, but after we displace him, then we can have a real voice. And he keeps suggesting that we send him proof that we can in fact sing well because he sits on several boards. But the insinuation that there's not enough qualified Black people is actually kind of dangerous and untrue, especially coming from someone.
I'll have this linked in the description. I'm trying to be statesman here. I'm trying to be, fair and allow people to form their own opinion on their own time after viewing the video, all the way down to not hear naming the person in question. So if y'all want to go see that and go, get all the tea, I'll have a link to this video in the description. But to the person in question, Scott, when I sent you this video, was this a person whose name you knew in the world of opera or otherwise?
Babatunde?
No, the person that Babatunde is speaking.
No, I did not know that name.
I didn't know this person's name before I began my work with the Black Opera Alliance a couple years ago. So this definitely feels like a niche within a niche within a niche when we're talking about Black opera singers who aren't supporting other Black opera singers and that sort of thing. This is a story. This is something that we likely would never read on a New York Times or even a local news station. This is very much a social media bit of news. How important do you think it is for the arts in general to acknowledge bits of news, bits of media like this, to sort of take a look at maybe some of the not so pretty things that are going on in so-called classical music?
If you want to tap into the audience you don't have, it's essential. And I've been trying to say that at my job for a long time. Why do we not have a TikTok account? Why are we not following that trend? Because we're missing the boat on it. But excuse me, most of the public stations that I've worked at, it didn't seem like their social media presence was something that was really tended and nurtured. Do you have any experience with that?
I did my best every day, my first job down at WUOT, not only to post on the social media for the organization, but to really be in the moment and do hourly posts or play-by-plays or whatever. I think that extended into my job at NPR with the Music Through the Night Facebook page. I think there's a bridge that has to be built between folks who are really great at some compelling or engaging social media and the people who would typically be following those social media accounts. The Minnesota Opera did had some very fun social media stuff going on around Black Friday, that definitely, created new followers for them and that sort of thing. I imagine that many of their followers on social media didn't get the references that were being made, but they got new folks involved now.
Now, as far as the tea itself, though, that is what I think is the new thing in classical and opera. Yeah. Because you hear hip hop artists, rock artists of every sort, they've got beef going all the time. Yeah. So do you think that we're going to start seeing classical beef?
I mean, there's definitely the potential for some content to be created. I mean, the Real Housewives of classical music, or love and classical music,
love Baroque style.
I mean, look, I need to be on that show, first of all. Do
Go
not
ahead.
create that show without me. But we have the material. The content is there. And I think folks like Babatunde, are not only jumping on that from that content perspective, just to, engage people in a new way, while that is something that he's really great at. I think when it comes to this post, this story in particular, he's trying to, put out a word of warning to other Black opera singers and just give people on the outside of it some tea as far as what happens behind the scenes. We saw a lot happen as far as so-called call out culture in 2020, and I will be the first to say that I think that we benefited from the normalization of call out in a more open and out front way, especially in the arts, especially in classical music.
Mm.
I wonder if you think the sun is setting on that. Should we be looking at less call out culture sort of things if we're leaning toward change, or should we continue to explore what can happen, what positive benefits can happen with directly stating things publicly?
It seems like the ones that needed to get their comeuppance and get called out and
Mhm.
have some sort of a reaction from their fans, I think it was well placed.
Mhm.
But let's take the latest Megan Thee Stallion and Tory Lanez dust up, though.
Mhm. Someone's on Twitter. Go ahead.
So no, because there's a cavalry coming to Tory's aid
Yeah.
in this situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, he got called out, but is there a consequence?
I mean,
Apart from his sentence,
right.
whatever
I
that's
mean,
going to be.
there's going to be that, but there will always be the supporters. R. Kelly still has supporters out here,
And then, but they're also going and attacking Megan now.
Right. So a part of it is, being in the public eye, especially on that level, is going to get some
Yep.
fire and some heat pointed your way, no matter what you do or no matter what happens. I guess on the classical music side of things, we just aren't so used to, at least broadly, we aren't so used to seeing it, which I think contributes to sort of the shock value of it.
It does, and that's why I was going to ask you: is don't you think we need some more of this to shrug off the stereotypes that classical and opera have?
The only reason I hesitate is because ultimately, again, Umoja today, first day of Kwanzaa, for fuck's sake, unity is something that I actually do believe in and think is always possible no matter what. I think,
Mhm.
if dialogue can happen, that means unity can happen. So, to the subject of this video by Babatunde, and he has all the receipts and the screenshots, which is also
Yeah.
shocking to see some of the verbal abuse that was happening in this situation from a so-called mentor. And even so, I still think that there is some dialogue that can happen toward that unity building. Now, all of that said, I cannot deny that people love the mess.
Yep.
People are always going to be here for the drama, and if that's how we get some different folks into the circles of classical music, I guess so be it. I mean, damn, why not add a little a hot sauce into the chili every now and again?
Yep. I told you a few weeks ago that one of the things I learned at that public radio conference over the summer was a key thing missing for younger listeners is the conflict,
Mhm.
the hot take, the tea, as you say. I think that this is part of the transition. This
Now
is just
be-
going to be part of it.
Okay, now be old Uncle Scott for a second. Should we just be getting along? Do you do you find room for critique of the younger generation's bloodthirst, bloodlust for the drama and for the social media
Sure, but
arguments
as
and
soon as I
things?
start making them, then they're going to start pointing out the things that I do.
You said I don't want no smoke.
And
with
I don't
none
want
of y'all.
and I don't want anybody coming after me just because I buy a candy at the hardware store
Yeah.
and carry a cloth handkerchief.
Sure. Okay. Well, my thing here, and I know that there are going to be a lot of people who are accusing me of kind of dancing here, not taking sides. I think it's hard to deny what Babatunde is saying in this video about this black opera star of note, with the receipts there. It'd be one
Yeah,
thing if it was just
yeah,
hearsay, but we have actual screen
yeah.
grabs and personal experience to back this up. I think, what is being put forward here is unacceptable. I think it's the responsibility of every person in the arts who is alleging to, be a mentor or to be, reaching down to pull up. I think it's a duty of all of those people to have some real rapport with the, up and coming superstars, but especially the, those of us who have had to deal with, various systems of marginalization and that sort of thing, black opera stars of marginalized whatever. I think there's a special duty there. I'll use that word duty
Mm.
to really, try to do your best for the next generation of black opera
Yes.
stars. And if there is evidence that, not only are you not doing it, but you're pushing down and punching down, it's hard to be forgiving of that.
Mm.
And I would love to have a dialogue with the person in question here. So, maybe we can work on that for 2023. But in the meantime, I just wanted to give a shout out to Babatunde, and Scott, you have to applaud his courage, because there are so many opera singers out here,
stepping
and
out. Yeah.
if this bullet touches your spirit, that means I'm talking to you. There are so many opera singers and professionals in the field, even more broadly, that would never ever call out this sort of behavior, and I understand, the risks. I don't want to sit on any high horse and do any of that,
No.
or say any of that. And I think it is of note to have people who are willing to really stick their neck out for the sake of other people who might need to know.
Sure,
It's
sure.
not always about shaming someone. It's about a word of warning sometimes. So again, shout out to Babatunde. I'll have that video posted in the description of this. Be sure to let me know what you think. And hey, again, the person in question, if y'all are interested in me having a conversation with them on TRILLOQUY, help me out. Send the email. Let's do what we need to do to get some dialogue going. I would be more than interested and willing to do that from a very understanding place, a non-accusatory place, a place that is centered on unity and unity alone. All right. Well, to get us into the second movement, we're going to hear from Babatunde. I don't know if you remember, but we've already heard Babatunde give a little hip hop flip to the Largo Al Factotum from
Sure.
the Barber of Seville. Well, I found a very just awe-inspiring rendition of the Nigerian national anthem by Babatunde. So, in the spirit of Kwanzaa and maybe even Pan-Africanism, as many of us aspire to, we're going to hear Babatunde perform this national anthem to get us into the second movement.
Arise, O compatriots, Nigeria's call obey, to serve our fatherland with love and strength and faith. The labor of our heroes past shall never be in vain, to serve with heart and mind, one nation bound in freedom, peace and unity.
If I can make any general wish for 2023, I would love to have the opportunity to go visit the continent, go visit the motherland.
Yeah.
I think West Africa would be the most important for me as far as ancestral connections, but of course going to South Africa would be very interesting. Seeing the pyramids would be a thing.
Mhm.
We were watching a video today about how they filmed some of Star Wars in Tunisia.
Right.
I think that's cool. Do you, on your bucket list of places, is there a spot on the African continent?
Well, you mentioned the pyramids, but in South Africa, there's some of the tallest waterfalls
Mm-hmm.
in the world. I forget what
Yeah,
they're
maybe
called.
Victoria Falls
There,
is one.
there
Yeah.
you go. So I would probably go there. I can't think of anything else jumping out at me.
You know, we all know that Australia has all of the really dangerous Pokemon, but you know,
Everything's trying to kill you.
But even in Africa, I would be a little intimidated by some sort of jungle expedition going to see Victoria
bit.
Falls. I think I would need to stay in the city, at least for at least for my first trip. You know,
Yeah.
go to the cafes, stay at the hotel, and then maybe the next time around, I can go get chased by a lion in the Jeep.
But it would be interesting to visit some of those cities like Cairo and
Yeah, just historical
and
places.
sure, but the things that you see in movies,
Yeah.
you know, all the old famous black and white ones too.
Hmm.
Nothing leaps to mind except for that, though.
Yeah. Well, again, shout out to Baba Tunde. Hope to make it over to the motherland one of these days. But we're here in the second movement now, where Scott and I are going to take the second ending and give a little bit of room to some music that we've been listening to over the week. I'm going to get us started this week. So I mentioned my Kwanzaa special. One of the pieces that I include in the special is Imani Wynn's rendition of a tune called Afro Blue by Mongo Santa Maria. It was arranged for wind quintet by Valerie Coleman quite beautifully. And, you know, not only is it a track that I include in my Kwanzaa special because it sounds sort of Afrocentric, when I'm engaging in dialogue with someone who has virtually no connection to classical music whatsoever, that, you know, that's one of the recordings that I pull up, you know,
Really?
as far as, you know, really significant things for 2022. I've been spending a lot more time in New York this year, you know, getting to meet people and hang out with people, folks who are with me in my Buddhist organization. And, you know, just getting to share Imani Wynn's with them, and specifically their arrangement of Mongo Santa Maria's Afro Blue has been a really great experience for me. On one of my visits, you know, because in our Buddhist organization, we do home visits, you know, especially for folks who are maybe sick or might need some at-home encouragement. Anyway, on one of those home visits, I pull out my recording of Imani Wynn's Afro Blue, and the person that we were visiting pulls out a version that I had never heard of. I think it was actually Duke Ellington or somebody, you know, doing their own version of it. So now I'm going in and listening to all of these different versions of this track that I had never heard of before, but you know, I know the song based on the arrangement. And the one that I want to share here today that I think is just so incredible is the one from the Fantasy Records 1959, you know, featuring Mongo Santa Maria's Afro Blue. Maybe this is the original. I need to do some more research, but the sound of it is just so intriguing and engaging to me, and it makes me appreciate Imani Wynn's version even more, you know, after hearing this and hearing what they were able to do to transform this into wind quintet. Anyway, Mongo Santa Maria's Afro Blue from the 1959 album Mongo from Fantasy Records. I know I say this all the time. I hate to cut it off because it's a vibe. This recording is about 4 minutes long. So, you know, if you were putting this in radio programming, it's not that, you know, you've ruined someone's day with an hour long of something that's a little bit different. You know, I would put this and what you know, and sorry to get inside baseball, but I will put this in the window if I was really trying to integrate this into something, create some sort of break where I can, you know, draw a connection between the idea of classical music and how we have this solely instrumental recording here that speaks to a different classical tradition. I think pieces like this, you know, are that bridge, and Imani Wynn's was my bridge to this piece of music that I think is a bridge. So, you know, we can talk about covers, classical covers of songs that can get us to actually airing these originals or putting them in our classical spaces. I usually, you know, like I was saying before, listen to Afro Blue around Kwanzaa time because it's a part of, the programming that I've done. But this recording in particular, I'm definitely going to be returning to, and in whatever way I can integrate it into some of my upcoming radio projects, I am, because when I think about a renewed view of classical music and a means of getting more people involved and interested, to me, this is an example of one of those tracks, one of those aesthetics by which we can do that. Here's a little bit of the end of it, since I love it so much here of Afro Blue. Again, Mongo Santa Maria from the album Mongo. And again, we can make a case for this on a more jazz aligned stage or radio program, and that's fine. I just think there's a perfect argument for this to be included next to Berlioz and Brahms, especially considering that we don't have the vocal aspect. We don't have that barrier that people like to point to, or we're talking about an instrumental track here, and a track that highlights classical music. Maybe not from the Western European perspective, but classical music nonetheless.
I'd put it in the hour.
But as far as like one of the main features of what,
you want to talk inside baseball. We're going inside baseball on this response. But you're talking about, you said you'd put it in the window, the news window.
Mm-hmm.
And that means where we worked, that means where another station out in the network might put a newscast.
Right.
So if there's an important story attached to it, some of the stations are going to miss it.
Yeah.
So I'd put it in the hour.
I mean, I guess
inside.
I guess I can appreciate that call out, because maybe it should go in the hour. I just think, I don't know. I guess I'm thinking about some of the arguments and discussions that would surround, broadcasting a piece of music like that.
Yep.
I think a middle ground would be that window. It's 4 minutes long. Not even all the stations are going to get it, but I'm with you. It should be a main feature. So I'm going to do that. Well, we're going to talk about New Year's resolutions next week, but I think among my resolutions will be to incorporate that recording into one of my so-called classical music radio programs. So here we go. Let's see if we can make that work. All right.
All right.
What you got this week?
You know how last week I brought in the Fleet Foxes, and I think I stumbled on their name at the same spot last week, because it was a song that I like to listen to at the solstice.
Mm-hmm.
And the song I'm bringing in this week is the song I like to listen to around New Year. It's Along December by the Counting Crows, and the frontman, Adam Duritz, said this is a Christmas song.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people listen to it and they hear the melancholy and they think it's sad. But in my mind, I kind of hear like maybe you're coming up out of a down period with this song. I hear possibility. I hear the possibility of redemption or forgiveness in these lyrics, and just a sense of letting yourself be yourself.
Along December, and there's reason to believe maybe this year will be better than the last. Remember the last thing that you said as you were leaving, but now the days go by so fast. And it's one more day up in the canyon, and it's one more night in Hollywood. If you think that I could be forgiven,
as the years go by, people fall away. They come into your life. They fall out of your life. You start to accept certain things you never would have believed before, like when you were in your 20s or your 30s. you notice things that you wouldn't necessarily notice before, and react to them in a different way as the years go by. That's what I think the song speaks to. And I think that, yeah, there's a melancholy to it, but there's also this feeling of, well, there's possibility ahead. There's always possibility ahead.
You know, there are some people, when you talk about some people last, some people don't. There's some people who I am not taking into 2023, and that's all I will say on that. But I mention it to say there's something freeing about just coming to terms with the fact that some people are temporary in your life, you know, and I think it makes me even more grateful for the people who have not been temporary in my life. I have friends, you know, some of my, I can think of some people that I still talk to, you know, even if not every day, but still talk to, that I've known since kindergarten. Like, that definitely exists for me. But, you know, some of my best friends, my old time friends, are folks that I've known, you know, since late high school and undergrad and college. And there's effort that's required in maintaining relationships. You know, so I'm guilty of sometimes not doing everything that I should, you know, to maintain certain relationships, with the excuse of work, with the excuse of how busy or tired or whatever I am.
All that.
But I am I'm grateful, you know, for the relationships that have lasted. And, you know, I think it's healthy and beneficial to be able to recognize, you know, the proverbial leaves in your life and separate them from the proverbial tree. What do you call it? The part that you hug.
The trunk.
The trunk. For those of us who hug trees.
Yeah, it's interesting that you make that analogy, because one of the lines in here, he says, you know, you get the feeling that it's a lot of oysters but no pearls. But where you give up that feeling, the next line says, and then you look across a crowded room and see the way the light attaches to a girl. It's like your life might not be what you wanted in some areas, but it is in others. And I think it speaks to something that I'm going to take into 2023, which is contentment.
Yeah.
I'm just going to try to be more content with the things that I have and not covet the things that I don't.
I would love to hear. So we have this lead singer at the piano. I think not to get him out of a job or anything. It could be interesting to hear that for piano and cello, or
sure.
maybe even, you know, get into some of his twang and give us a little bit of piano and trombone. Maybe there are definitely some
Nice.
crossovers and some bridges here. And while I'm not so familiar with Counting Crows, I have heard of that band enough to be able kind of to argue, you know, if I need to, that this is, you know, American classical. Would you, you know, as someone who I'm sure is more familiar than I am, would you or could you make an argument for the music, at least some of the music of Counting Crows, being music that we should include in this renewed idea of American classics?
Yeah, just the amount of time that they spent out in, you know, the music world, cranking out hits and winning awards. But that was a generational defining band.
Yeah.
From the late 80s and the early 90s. I mean, there were so many people that found such meaning in the Counting Crows, and I was one of them.
Yeah.
You know, and the first release, every track had a feeling like, how do I know this? Why do I know this feeling or this melody or whatever? It hit on something that was pretty universal in that time.
Counting Crows, Long December. If you don't know it, go learn a little bit more of our American classical repertoire and check it out. I know I will. All right, well, we're getting into the third movement, and I'm very honored this week to share with y'all my conversation with VJ Iyer. Scott, have to say, again, I already mentioned that I was spent a lot more time in New York this year, outside of Carnegie Hall one night. You know, my job had a performance there, so I'm just kind of, you know, killing the 5 minutes that I got, and I hear, Garrett, are you Garrett McQueen? And it's VJ Iyer who says that. I'm like, oh my gosh, wait a minute, you should not know my name. I should know your name. Anyway, I've been a fan of VJ Iyer's orchestral music for years now, but through our conversation and learning more about him, I learned that he also did some jazz. So I've been so-called jazz, maybe I should say. That is one of the things we talk about in our conversation, but I've been checking out more of that music. VJ VJ has a new work called Human Archipelago. You know, we're talking about connection and unity that's been premiered by the London Symphony, I believe it was, with performances happening throughout January and into the new year with a few American ensembles. I'll have information about that in the description. But to get us into my conversation with VJ, I wanted to play again some of this so-called jazz. So y'all will get to hear what VJ thinks or says about that idea of jazz. But this tune is called Optimism. I think that this is a really great, aesthetically, a great piece, you know, to round out the year with and to take into the new year. But one, you know, with the theme of optimism that I think we need more of as well these days. So huge thanks to everyone who made this interview possible. My conversation with the one and only VJ Iyer. Hope y'all enjoy.
Yes, it's funny. Like I find that as a living or contemporary or so-called new music composer, among the other hats I wear, when I enter into these classical music, Western classical music realms, it's often the case that they want to place it alongside works from the past to kind of validate it on in those terms. And often even, I was just talking to someone else about this, that I've had this pattern of getting asked to respond to works from the past with new works of mine. Like one was Rade Rade, which was a response to Rite of Spring. It was commissioned for the 100th anniversary of Rite of Spring. Another was for Jennifer Coe, the first piece I wrote for her, Bridge Tower Fantasy, tribute to George Bridgetower, and it was a companion piece to the Kreutzer Sonata, which was, as you may know, already actually originally written for him.
Right.
What else? I had to finish a Mozart fragment for the Brentano Quartet, an unfinished fragment. I had to write some variations based on a theme by Robert Schumann for pianist Mishka Rashimomin. I had to write an overture to the C major Bach cello suite for Matt Heimovitz. So it's a kind of like, there's a pattern where you have to sort of situate yourself in relation to history or to the past, and basically like validate yourself in terms of the past. And so that's interesting. Like when we were in London for the premiere of Human Archipelago, it was like Wagner.
Oh, wow.
And, Mendelssohn, so it was between Wagner and Mendelssohn on the program, which was, and I know that some of the programs in Oregon, like Oregon Symphony, for example, is pairing it with, I want to say, Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony and some other works from the past, like that. So it's like, yeah, I know. And then it's nice when you can be on a whole program of new material, or have a portrait concert, for example, where you're just presenting your own works, a spectrum of your own works as one concert. But those are quite rare, as you say, and always feel like kind of on life support a little bit compared to these gigantic events where they're playing the great chestnuts, and people might endure a new piece in order to get to the Mendelssohn or something like that.
Right. You used the phrase so-called new music. I wonder if you'll speak more to that. Has that phrase new music become problematic? Yeah, that's definitely a phrase I use, but so-called new music, that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I would have said so-called classical also. Um, well, new music, like, I mean, I write music all the time, but not all of it gets called new music.
Hmm.
So it's really very much it's a community or a network or a space or a marketplace or something like that that's very specific. And it has named itself that to to do something. I don't know, to maybe like sell itself as interesting. But part of what it's predicated on, almost without fail, is continuity with European modernism.
Hmm.
And that's why I find it, I find it a little tenuous as a conceit. you
Mm-hmm.
know, I know that it's basically a branding exercise, but it's kind of like, um, I mean, I also do the same thing with jazz. I usually say so-called jazz or the music
Yeah.
called jazz, the things like
Mm-hmm.
that, just to sort of put a little pressure on it or put some distance. Because that's what I learned, like from all the elders who I worked with and who mentored me. None of them would routinely use the word jazz enthusiastically.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
were all sort of like, well, they would kind of like let themselves be programmed at jazz festivals or in jazz series or at a jazz club even, but usually the way they framed what they were doing was much more expensive than that, and I think jazz as a label has always reduced the mobility and the kind of possibility.
Yep. Yep. I wonder what your ideas are when it comes to reframing, those branding words, as you've said. I mean, even with your own compositions, do you feel any sort of pressure or even have in mind, how people will engage your music as it relates to those terms? I know on the broadcast side of things, the phrase new music instantly makes people think, oh, this is going to be crunchy. This is going to be very dissonant. Are there any considerations for the language around your music when you're writing your music?
I don't know. I don't really think about the language or how to frame it. I mean, because that's basically that's the marketing people's job, I guess, and
Mm,
it's maybe my job to actually defy all of that. As an artist, is to like make my own choices and carve my own path. Certainly informed by all these different histories and connected to all these different communities, but also like I think it's maybe just the artist that I am. I've always been a kind of like it's funny. Yesterday was my birthday, and just
oh,
for
happy belated.
thanks. Just for fun, I posted all these old photos of myself, like like one from when I was a toddler, one from when I was about 8 or 9, then a couple from when I was a teenager. And it's funny, like as you see it progress, I get more and more emo, but just a little like
Nice.
darker, but like darker in sort of affect, I guess.
Right, right.
But it's always being channeled through the piano, in those photos. So it's sort of like you see how I become a brooding artist. It's really
Yeah.
funny. I start as this like gleeful toddler, and then I become a more like an emo teenager playing the piano or playing synthesizers or something. So I think like there's always been an element for me of just like resistance as a sort and sort of like um, kind of like melancholy. There's a certain like melancholy around systems that we have inherited or the systems we find ourselves trying to operate in.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
certainly as artists of color, as people of color in the West, um, that's where a lot of that comes from, so that's where a lot of the skepticism or the sort of critical distancing comes from. It comes from like knowing that these systems aren't really here for us.
Yeah. And I often find myself, experiencing some dissonance myself because I think about the systems that have been built against people of color and black people specifically in the United States. But I also think about the the fruits of those labors. You know, we were already talking about so-called jazz. I wonder if you could talk about where your affinities or love for, you know, those black musical traditions came from. Was there jazz played in your house as a kid? Where did that love come from?
Um, yeah, I've had to kind of like rethink a lot of that. Like, where did it come from? You know, it's been an interesting kind of reassessment of what my affinities were as a kid. Because I listened to a lot of pop music and rock and soul. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know? So, like Michael Jackson, Prince,
Yeah.
some Stevie Wonder, you know, a lot of early hip hop, but then also classic rock. Like, I grew up in the suburbs. So there was a lot of, you know, if you just turn on a radio in suburbs of Rochester, New York, the first song you hear is like Hotel California or something,
Yeah.
Stairway to Heaven, something like that. So like you kind of are always being fed that stuff. And then I remember there was a black station, WDKX, in Rochester that played a wide range of things, you know, Pointer Sisters, Stevie,
Hmm.
Marvin Gaye, you know, and then also some of the early hip hop, Whitney Houston, like a lot of different things. So, um, uh, so I remember that being this kind of like source of intrigue for me as a sort of like, well, this is clearly like coming from another community than the one I find myself sort of embedded in, you know. And then the other thing, well, so there were a few different things. One was like I would see music on TV, which was like more common. Like I remember, um, like when Herbie Hancock did Rocket at the Grammys
Yeah.
in like 81, I think. I want to say 81 or 82. Because like I had seen it on MTV. It was one of the only, he was the only non-white people on MTV at the time. But it
Yeah.
was only like he was barely in the video, you know. There's only these dancing robots, and then his face shows up on a television screen in the fireplace. Like, do you remember that? So, but then like the way he kind of carried himself on that stage at the Grammys, seeing that as a kid and like seeing all those robots, you know, you see these dancing robots like in the video, but then they came to life, and then it was like this revelation halfway through the performance.
Yeah.
But then like Herbie in the middle of it with such like confidence and um I don't know, just sort of like sass, you know.
Right.
And then like a few years
Swag.
later, I I had been playing piano by ear growing up, and I had classical violin lessons. So um then like my high school had a jazz ensemble, so I started paying attention to that stuff a little bit more specifically, you know, and started checking out records from the library, like LPs. And I remember seeing the same name, Herbie Hancock, and he had a band. There was a quartet album he had that had come out in the mid '80s with Tony Williams and Ron Carter and young Wynton Marsalis.
Hmm.
It's like pretty phenomenal. Those guys were flying, and it was like the level of creativity I could barely fathom. You know, I was like, "This is the same guy who did Rocket. How is this the
Hmm.
same person?" And then I started like trying to triangulate. Found Miles Davis, then older Miles Davis records with John Coltrane or with Wayne Shorter, and then some of the Electric Miles. And then eventually I realized that a lot of these people were playing these tunes by Thelonious Monk. And so I found some of his records, and then that like blew my head open because it was, he wasn't doing what anyone else was doing, musically
Yeah.
speaking, compositionally. The way he took up space in the music was so different, you know, his playfulness, his mystery, his like the way he would shock you with sound, you know. And I remember seeing that film. This was way before YouTube, of course, but there was that film Straight No Chaser, which was like one of the early documentaries about Monk that came out
Hmm.
in late '80s. And that really, like seeing him play, kind of put it all together for me. And then I actually felt this really deep affinity to the way he played. That was like, oh, that feels familiar to me. Like that feels relevant to how I touch the piano, how I bang on the piano, how I
Yeah.
bounce on the piano, how he gets the instrument resonating and ringing and shaking, and the sort of elemental quality of it, and it wasn't about like dazzling you with a whole bunch of like fast stuff. It was actually about uh, reaching in your body. Like that's how it felt to me. It was like giving you this feeling that was like very physical, was very
Mhm.
active. So that I became kind of obsessed with him around then. Around that time, I also was turned on to Jerry Allen, her early stuff from the late 80s that really shook me too. So she became a huge, and still is huge inspiration for me.
Yeah, yeah. When you mentioned, Herbie Hancock, you remind me. So, I practice Nichiren Buddhism, and when I found out that
Mm.
Herbie Hancock also, practices Nichiren Buddhism, I wanted to learn everything about him, and I almost could not believe the Western classical origins of his training. His debut
Right.
being with the Chicago Symphony, I
Yes.
believe, playing
Yes.
playing Beethoven.
Mm.
It I wrestle, in the same way we were talking about so-called jazz. I tend to wrestle with that word classical, or that phrase classical music,
Absolutely.
because there are
Absolutely.
so many people who want to dismiss it, or dissolve it, put it in a corner. But my argument is that all of the musicians that you've been talking about represent American classical music, in the same that classical musics around the world are different, and depend on culture. Do you
That's
think
right.
it's worth the battle to reframe that phrase, classical music being in reference to, in our American context, being in reference to folks like Herbie Hancock? Or do you find
Mm.
yourself more on the side of wanting to just push the phrase away?
I'm kind of I'm this weird I'm a weirdo who hates nouns. So I
Okay.
tend to push all of these big nouns away. But I certainly like a lot of elder musicians like Billy Hart, or others from that generation, people who, certainly Dr. Billy Taylor used to talk about this. They advanced that framing, like jazz is America's classical music.
Right.
It deserves to be on a concert stage. It deserves to be treated with respect. That was a battle, like that had to be fought in the 20th century. Um, and still does, and even like Gary Bartz will say stuff like that. So, I respect that has been part of that struggle. Like people have found different strategies to kind of reframe what they're doing and reframe themselves and assert. You know, Black artists have always had to kind of assert mobility when it was denied to them. So, like, I deserve to be on that stage. That kind of thing. I deserve to be. I'm composing too. You know, that kind of thing. Which, like, so that's been I mean, it's been wonderful. I guess what I can say about what's been called new music of late is
Hmm.
that it has been making efforts to become more inclusive of of people from a lot of different backgrounds and using a lot of different methods, including methods that come from other cultures besides Western classical music culture.
Right.
So, like, someone like Roscoe Mitchell can write orchestra pieces, or Wadada Leo Smith can write orchestra pieces, or Nicole Mitchell can write orchestra pieces. And they might be put together with very different strategies, different aesthetics, different techniques, even um, different systems, different ordering systems.
Yeah.
And that's, and like I learned from a lot of especially a lot of the AACM artists who I was lucky to be, still am lucky to be kind of in the world with and mentored by George Lewis and Henry Threadgill, Roscoe
Hmm.
Mitchell, Wadada Leo Smith, Muhal, Richard Abrams. Claudine Myers. I got to see their sort of like up close. I got to witness the fearlessness with which they would enter these spaces that didn't have them in mind,
Sure.
and then
Yep.
like assert that their work deserves to be there and deserves to be taken as seriously as any of the other stuff that's on that stage.
Yeah.
So that's like, and I remember getting advice from like Roscoe and Muhal about my first piece for string quartet and piano with myself on piano, where I was sort of like, this was the piece that is called Mutations 1 through 10, which is on the album Mutations. I wrote that back in 05, 04, 05. And I remember at that time I was sort of like kind of worried about fitting in, like, oh, well, will this be taken as a kind of like valid form of, or a valid use of the string quartet? And and they were just they disabused me of those kind of like concerns pretty quick. They were like,
Sure.
just figure it out for yourself on your own terms. Anything you bring to, whatever you bring to them is something they won't have already, and that's what matters. So that has been really a long time source of inspiration for me. That whole community of artists who are associated with what's called the creative music movement. Oliver Lake is another one. I didn't know that he had like stacks and stacks of string quartets that he had written that could fill like 2 evenings of music,
I didn't know that either. Wow.
Yeah, until, I was like, oh yeah, I got these. He just like pulled them out of his back pocket, It's like, and yeah, Wadada has talked a lot about that. And I'm just seeing him in action with these different kinds of ensembles, getting them to really rethink their own assumptions about what they're doing, It's just given me a lot of confidence to approach things on my own terms, A lot of which is influenced by them, of course.
Yeah. And that relationship between, so-called classical music, creative music, and identity or race, that's definitely a big thing that's happening in the arts these days. But when it comes to your piece, Human Archipelago, I also find it really interesting to think about how the arts engages things like climate change and those conversations in the same way that many people, love it or hate it, had a so-called racial awakening in 2020. I feel like I had a similar thing when it comes to the issue of climate change. I watched that Leonardo DiCaprio documentary and I was like, oh, wow, this is something that matters. I wonder if you had that moment or if it's a thought you've always had, climate change and our planet that we live on.
Well, I think what has really kept me very close to that issue, increasingly so, has been having a child. Like my daughter is now 17. Gen Z is so mad at us, rightfully so, because like we have not given them a future, like, and they do not trust us. And so just seeing that play out on this generation wide scale, they're like, okay, you guys don't care if we die. Like that's what you're doing to us right now, to the planet. You failed to act on gun violence after Parkland. You managed to get a diabolical, pathological liar, con artist elected president. You guys did this. We didn't do this. We were kids, So, so they see us kind of like messing up and they hold us to it. They're like, this is on you, you guys. We have to just grow up and deal with the harms that you have visited on this planet and on all of us. So I think like, and also teaching, I think it's just like, it's kind of like very vivid, because you're always thinking about people's futures,
Yeah.
As a parent, you're thinking about that. And as a teacher, you're thinking about that. Like, well, and then meanwhile, you see extremes of, like climate extremes, like heat waves, floods, tsunamis, like tornadoes, and like unlikely places, hurricanes, all this destruction, and then like seeing all these most vulnerable communities being essentially abandoned by these systems that purport to take care of us. So that's like, it's just been like wave after wave of it, and it just feels all the more crucial because, maybe, yeah, sure, like you and I will die in the next 40 or 50 years. Like,
Yeah.
what about all these kids who have to then deal with what we have left? So yeah, that's been a kind of burning, more and more, I'd say, increasing over the last few years, kind of like burning issue.
So with those things in mind, I wonder if you'll talk about the development of Human Archipelago. As you were writing, did you, feel all of these Gen Z fingers pointing at you? Was it a sense of sorrow? What surrounded your writing this piece of music?
Well, it was actually like, for me, I'm good friends with Tedra Cole, the writer, and he'd written this book called Human Archipelago that is about the kind of like entangled issues of climate change and mass migration. You have all these climate refugee populations. Sometimes it's not even framed as such because the media sort of lack the vocabulary to name it, and so it's like a book of text and photographs that sort of, very intimate portraits of refugees, actually, like photographic portraits of refugees in motion or in their displaced environments, and knowing that that's what brought them there was some kind of fleeing floods or fleeing drought or fleeing, just global destruction,
Mm-hmm.
of their environments. So, and the wars around oil are a part of this too. So yeah, these were, some of it was just like working through that text and those images and just sitting with these faces and these phrases, and not necessarily wanting to make an exact parallel to that book or anything like that, but just sort of sitting with those truths, and trying to, trying to work with the idea of precarity, I guess, as a sort of motivating force in the piece. And so that's like, it's a cello concerto, of course, and it is sort of like it's organized in a way that foregrounds a soloist with an orchestra, and but then there's this other population in the mix. There's a group, unspecified instrumentation. I call them the travelers in the score, and they only play by ear. I've given them some constraints so that they have a sense of how to work together.
Sure.
But basically they create their own parts, and they don't have music stands. They're just sitting in the orchestra in front near the soloist. So it has almost like a concerto grosso kind of format, but they are doing something pretty different from anyone else. And then it's about how those precarious forms that they generate, how they fit into the system and into the larger system of the orchestra and the soloist. Like, who is the protagonist and who are these mysterious figures who are also doing something that seems to matter, there's like a kind of urgency in what they're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and an interdependence, and it's inherently unpredictable. That's basically what I wanted to do, and this is something I've learned from all the people I mentioned before is like, how do you make space for the unknown in your music? Make space for the unforeseen and make that a feature of what's happening so that it pins everyone to the present and makes everyone listen in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, part of it for me is like, there's not a lot of listening that happens in orchestras. I mean, that's like a harsh
You're
way to
right.
put it,
You're right.
but it's
though.
like, compared to chamber music, for
Right.
example, it's so interdependent and so interactive. It's all about listening, because of the scale of the orchestra and the nature of orchestration, it tends to be like, well, just follow your instructions and stay in time with the foreman up front, and
Mhm.
and you'll be paid. Like that's it. So like, there's not that level of like buy-in, to what's happening. It's really like, well, uh, I'm a cog in this machine, and I'm not. This is sort of alienation that happens for those players, I think. So this is a sort of like, I wanted to let players opt in to this other role.
Hmm.
And all they have to do is self-report as having good ears. And we have like 4 to 6 such players. It's going to be different every time. Different instrumentation at every orchestra. I put some constraints on what kind of instruments they could be, just so that it balances well. But it's a pretty open-ended scenario, and that is kind of like, how does everybody relate to this presence of the unknown, to this like precarious form that emerges in the context of an otherwise very organized piece.
Yeah. And when you speak to the collaborative nature of the piece, I can't help but to think about Inbal Segev, who offered the premiere. I actually happened to be sitting next to her at the concert that I saw you at Carnegie, so it was cool to speak with her. But again, when it comes to collaboration, were you writing this piece of music with her in mind specifically? Was this a collaboration between you and the cello soloist?
Yes, it was. I mean, in the sense that I had a sense of what she is good at. She's great at many, many things. But in particular, I learned, because I wrote as a warm up sort of gesture, I think, like she had me write a duo piece for us that we recorded, that came out on an album she put out last year. I think the album's called 20 for 2020. And it was just very much one of these pandemic projects. It's sort of like, well, let's see what we can do together under these confined circumstances. And that was, so it was like I wrote this piece that we played together. And so in the course of preparing that, writing it, sitting with her recordings, and then rehearsing with her and getting a sense of how she listens, how she plays, how she interacts. I learned that she has perfect pitch, and in fact that she can kind of basically match whatever she hears instantly, and quite a few players do. It's not a big deal, or they have really exceptional relative pitch, which is like what I have, and I don't know if it's exceptional, but it's like I had to learn how to like figure out the changes to a song in one chorus, things like that, just by listening to it and be like, okay, I got it. Let's go. I had to learn that like 30 years ago on the job playing at jam sessions, So, so I can kind of like make my way by ear. And that's most of what I do as a pianist, really, is I try to train my ear so I can reach deeper into something, but a lot of it is just summoning from within in that way and relating to what's around you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, noticing that she could do that, I was like, oh, well, that gives us some options that are not usually present in orchestral or concerto type of music, this sort of more interactive possibility or format, you know. So I already had this idea of the Travelers, but then knowing that she could kind of merge with them became something that mattered. So then I could build that into the form, actually, that she could kind of, as a soloist, merge with the Travelers, and then that would have a sort of narrative force to it when that happens, you know, in the
Yeah.
context of the piece.
Yeah. There's so many aspects of, the platforming and the creation of this music that typical concert goers don't always see. I think the commissioning and funding side of it is, one of those in particular. I do understand that Human Archipelago was in part the result of New Music USA's Amplifying Voices program. I wonder if generally you can just speak to the role that service organizations have played in your career, and unless you've been able to walk straight up to the front door of an orchestra and get them to play your pieces.
Oh, I wish. No, not yet. This is yeah, I mean, it's worked in different ways. I mean, like when I first came to New York, I was playing some gigs around town and stuff. I soon realized, like, okay, this isn't going to cut it in terms of just getting through the year or getting through
Yeah,
the month, you know.
sure.
Then I started looking at different funding organizations, grant giving, like grants for composers, for example, or grants for ensembles, or and what were the systems by which we could do that as so-called jazz people.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking beyond the existing confines, because there weren't a lot of grants that seemed to welcome jazz people doing jazz things, like if you have your own band and you're writing music for your band and going to play it even if you like partner with a nonprofit like the Jazz Gallery, which I did many times early in my New York years, which is a nonprofit, one of the few jazz nonprofits. I guess the other elephant in the room in New York is Jazz at Lincoln Center, which is also a nonprofit technically.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was easier to sort of say, like, well, can we partner on this grant? You could be the fiscal conduit, and let's see if we get some money to make something. And then that might buy me like a month or two of living, so I could actually write and work on music and make something that wasn't just sort of obvious,
Right.
It took some time to develop. And so I started, I remember like Mary Flagler Carey Charitable Trust, the back then Meet the Composer, the Jerome Foundation, Asian American Arts Alliance, the Creative Capital. I was one of I think I got either the first or the second wave of Creative Capital grants from like 20 years ago. For In What Language, the project with Mike Ladd. So sometimes it was like partnering with an institution and saying, well, what can we do together? And like maybe it sort of doesn't live in any category, but just through working together and bringing these resources together, we can buy ourselves some time, do something interesting that doesn't really exist yet, or that doesn't have any sort of like obvious precedent even, and rehearse it. And so like, yeah, I mean, like that was kind of one of the ways that I operated in my early years in New York. And so like often it was interdisciplinary projects. Then I think the first time that I got commissioned to write for a string quartet, this is the piece I was talking about earlier, Mutations, that was through Merkin Hall, but I think there was some funding from one of these, maybe it was the Carey Trust, one of those. So that gave me a chance to try something really new, because it was like, for me anyway, like a piano and string quartet piece that they're not coming from where I'm coming from. So how do I bridge that gap? So then that became like the format of the piece. Actually, it was like, how do we bring in these principles of variation that I'm very used to as an improviser, that composers also use, and that classical players can actually implement in different ways if you give them like very careful instructions. You can have these open scores that are open, and I'd studied like, how did other composers do that? How did
Mm-hmm.
Pauline Oliveros do it? How did Steve Reich do it? How did, these different American mavericks, how did
Sure.
they? But anyway, yes, it was always through like working with both with some sort of presenting organization and some sort of funding organization that was supporting the arts. And then knowing that that would exist in parallel to the stuff I did in the jazz business, it's sort of like a very different stream of activity from running around with my trio and playing in clubs or in jazz festivals, for example. It's a very different market, it's a very different system of support. So, and then like learning that we could kind of live in all those worlds, that we could, and that, they wouldn't always know about each other, but that was okay.
Yeah.
Because I knew that for me, it was all coming from the same place. And yeah, so it's, it was nice. I think when Inbal approached me, she had been in contact with Vanessa Reed from New Music USA, I think, right? And
Yep.
And that was, in fact, it was that she who made the introduction, in fact, and that was how this kind of got off the ground. And I know there's a lot of coordinating between them and these different orchestra music directors, and then also my publisher, Shot Music, who also get involved in managing this whole process and keeping it smooth and streamlined, and building a consortium of commissioners so that it becomes possible for me to sit down for like 6 months and write a piece,
Yep.
not 9 months or something, like I spent the whole first half of this year writing this piece.
Wow. Wow. So while we have the ears of the commissioners and the funders, I wonder if there's anything that's in development right now, the sketches of something that you're working on currently.
Well, there's a few things I have in the queue, I guess I'll put it that way. One is
Sure.
a solo piece for Vicky Chow, the pianist, for Disclavier, actually, which is, the piano that is also kind of a player piano, like
Mhm.
maybe, you can control it with electronics. So that's a sort of, I don't know, cybernetic themed piece. I'm kind of still developing that. Then I'm doing a piece for Shai Wasner, the pianist, and Echo Chamber Orchestra for next fall. And then also a piece for solo percussion with myself playing with them. That will happen at the end of next year. So
Awesome.
those are that's the handful of pieces that I can rattle off the top of my head. There's probably more I'm forgetting, but that's sort of the next year, I'd say. And then in the meantime, I have other recordings in the can, and I have a project with the vocalist Aruj Aftab and bassist Shahzad Ismaili that's coming out in March. So we'll be out and about with that album, Love in Exile, it's called. And also I made another trio album with Linda Mehan O and Taishan Sori. So that's also in the mix somehow. Kind of thread the needle, put all these things out there together. Oh, and one other thing I should mention, which is that BMOP recorded a few of my orchestral works. So one is the violin concerto I wrote for Jennifer Coe. Then there's a piece for strings and percussion and a chamber orchestra piece. So they recorded them all, and that's supposed to come out sometime next year too.
Awesome. Great,
Yeah.
great to hear that there's so much on your plate and on your calendar.
I kind of can't believe it. I'm not sure how I'll live through the next 12 months, but I'll be careful.
Well, for what it's worth, same.
Yes, please, please.
I'll wrap us up, by just pulling on that thread. You're mentioning these recordings. I've found that the thirst and acceptance of, again, so-called new music across broadcast systems, streaming and radio. It seems to be happening a little quicker than on the live concert front. As someone who exists both in the recording world and the live performance world, do you see one moving faster than the other? What do you see as the relationship between those two mediums for sharing music?
I think there are very different systems in those different contexts. I mean, I think as long as there's been this thing called jazz, there have been records, and so a lot of how it circulated was at a distance in that way. I remember saying at the beginning of the pandemic, well, we already have our socially distant way of sharing music. It's called a recording.
Yep.
I suggest you guys buy some. And then also there's always, and historically anyway, although things have shifted quite a bit as the terrain has shifted in the music, in the record business specifically, but there's always been a certain kind of relationship between record companies, the bigger record companies, and the concert world in jazz, which is that, if you have an album out, a record company, one of their jobs is to support it when you're touring, so like to kind of take out ads in those marketplaces, in those cities where you're touring, or like show up with a bunch of CDs or LPs to sell at the gig, things like that. That actually is like they're getting to where you're going. They're meeting you there and supporting what you're doing. So then you can, and it's partly because like this music is just hidden from the general public. Like you can't just. I mean, everybody knows about the new Taylor Swift record, but who knows about the new Steve Lehman record?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
And like, so you kind of, it's really been concealed from public view. And so these have been these kind of workarounds because it hasn't had the benefit of even the airwaves, particularly. With orchestral or with Western classical music, and its relationship to the record business. I mean, I think at the very elite echelons, like Deutsche Grammophon, people who are kind of like in that world, that's similar in that sense that it kind of works together, the record business and the concert business. They're symbiotic, I think when it comes to these, smaller scale ventures, like a lot of what's called new music, and it's not, they don't proceed it so much hand in hand like that, I don't think. It varies. I mean, I was just talking to Andy Akiho a few weeks ago, and that piece 7 Pillars has become this like workhorse for him. Like the Sandbox Percussion are touring the hell out of that piece. They're like playing it 20 or 30 times this year. They just did it with a choreographer and they do the whole thing from memory, so it's this kind of like event. It's a real stunt that they pull. So sometimes it's more like you partner as a composer, you partner with a performer who's going to champion the piece, and I mean, and then part of that is getting it recorded, getting it performed. And I feel like in the classical music world, like getting an orchestra piece performed means it's going to be performed in front of 1,000 or 2,000 people or something. And that means it might not sell that many records. I think it sells even less than a lot of jazz records sell, but it's kind of like it's in people's ears and in people's bodies in a different way, So I think it has a way of having its own impact that's deeper and even maybe in a lot of ways older than the record business. You know, like shop music. It kind of just dawned on me, like, oh, shop music is this ancient company. You know,
Hmm.
I've been with them several years, and Norman Ryan from Shop came to London for the premiere of the concerto, and he's like, "Yeah, I popped over to the Shop music store here, and I'm going to the one in Germany, which is the original, and they're still on the same plot of land that they were on in the 1700s."
Wow.
So, like,
Wow.
these companies are centuries old. You know, this is way older than the record business. And it's a very different system of dissemination and um, of sharing. You know.
A little bit there of Human Archipelago, a rehearsal clip there from the London Philharmonic Orchestra, the London Philharmonic, featuring cello soloist Inbal Segev, who I had the pleasure of meeting this year.
Yeah.
You know, sat next to her at a Carnegie Hall concert. You know, incredible things to happen in 2022. You know, when I think about you know, my first ideas of who VJ was as an artist, you know, a composer, an orchestral musician, and for that to expand into a person who not only has written so-called jazz, but connects his creativity, his compositions to things like climate change and social issues. In the in the interview, one of the things that he talks about is how having a daughter changed his perspective on
I
the
bet.
world that we're leaving, you know, in 20, 30, 40, 50 years for the next generation. You know, among my maybe my light affirmations or light resolutions for the new year, maybe, you know, I need to find ways to be a little bit more environmentally conscious. We definitely recycle in this house. Where, you know, I have a car, but we're public transit users, so you know there's a bit of that. But you know, there's always a little bit more room to do a little bit more. What do you think about, you know, taking environmental concerns into our next years? I'll say, you know, in New York, there's actually a countdown clock down by Union Square,
Yeah.
you know, that shows just how much time we got left, you know, before it's just irreparable.
Isn't it like 11:57 right now or something like that?
Something like that.
Yep.
Are there areas that you have shifted over years prior when it comes to being a little bit more environmentally conscious, and maybe areas in which you could expand to be even more so?
Absolutely. There's things like I'm now that I'm the one paying the electric bill,
Listen.
I'm looking at
Yep.
what an appliance uses as I'm starting to, you know, replace appliances. And
Because those 5-10 minutes on that space heater add up.
I'm telling you,
At the end
if
of
you're
the
doing
month.
that, if you're doing that a couple times a day,
Right. Ooh.
but really, for me, it was water. You know, I spent, I don't know how
All that
many
beer you brewing.
well, there's that. I've wondered how many gallons of beer does it really take to produce 5 gallons of beer? You know, it's probably going to take 30 to
Wow.
produce 5 gallons. By the
Yep.
time you talk about, you know, cleaning and all that other sort of, but you know how I had all that elaborate landscaping around my house
Yeah.
and I had a sprinkler system. Well, guess what? I don't have the cash. I don't have the disposable income anymore to run the sprinklers every other day to make sure that all the plants look nice.
Right. Right.
So that's where I'm looking is, you know, being judicious about that. Yeah, the lawn looks dusty and brown, but I ate that month.
Listen, and then, you know, I know that you have done some planting, some light gardening in the past.
Yep.
Maybe that's something that more people can have the courage to reach into. And I, you know, when I say have the courage, really, I'm speaking to myself because I'm not great at keeping plants. Of all of my talents, you know, a green thumb is one of the things that Goddess did not really give me.
Really?
But
Okay.
you know, there's always an opportunity to learn and to do a little bit more. You know, even in the arts field, and VJ is helping us, you know, point our attention toward that. So huge shout out and thanks to VJ Iyer for being on the last Opus of Triloquy for 2022. All right, well, we're getting into the last Triloquy for 2022, and we were kind of, as far as transition music here, Scott, we were trying to identify areas in which our most listened to tracks for the year sort of intersected. There was an intersection at Beyonce, of course, and we talked about a few other things, but what we ended up sort of centering on was the album Cheat Codes. I wonder if you could just give folks a little bit of a refresher about what this album was and how you came to bring it to Triloquy, because you put me on, actually.
Right. Black Thought is a member of, is it Jimmy Fallon's band with Questlove, right?
Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure, because there's been some recent
shakeups and all that.
Job transitions. But anyway, go ahead.
All right. But anyway, Black Thought teamed up with producer Danger Mouse. And for me, it was this love letter, this love mixtape from the late 90s, early aughts, this revisitation of just the sound that was part of my rudderless days in the old market of Omaha, Nebraska, and, sowing those wild oats.
Yeah. Well, for me, it felt like listening to the album felt like a time capsule of
That's another good way
hip hop, or like not a time capsule, but like a snapshot of something that is really important that happened, and it may have been a flash in the pan for a lot of people, but it's something that we will be returning to. I think Cheat Codes is definitely a great example of a classic, something that will be revisited in years in the future, even if it didn't get a whole bunch of attention. I think it got plenty of attention. Don't get me wrong, but I think the celebration of this music, the biggest celebrations of this music anyway, are yet to come. So I will agree. I think this is a very good intersection in our most listened tracks for 2022. So here's a little bit from that album, a track here called Identical Deaths, featuring Danger Mouse and Black Thought from, again, the album Cheat Codes. Bravo to the both of you and everyone on this production team. A little bit of this to get us into the final movement of this week's Opus.
I was proven effective by a clinical test for living many lives, dying identical deaths. I thought, why? How could this have ever been if I'm blessed? Then I had a talk with God, that was interview West. He said, Reek, as near as the west and far as the east, there's a warrant for your arrest by the karma police. The dharma was deep, I thought it was too dark to defeat, but made it here to tell a story by the chalk on my teeth. I'm a survivor, a thriver, a husband and a father. I rise with every morning and starving another saga. Empire Mars, fear of God, Oberlin, Yaga. Viva to either La Resistance or La Raza. I met the monster on the rooftop of the plaza. The teleprompter said it's still an Oscar to conquer. My witch doctor asked me what's blocking my chakra. I told him it was probably caffeine, chronic, and vodka. I need a word with a sponsor that won't be heard at a concert.
And this is one of the things about hip hop. It's not my Twitter bio thing anymore, pin tweet, I forget what it was, but basically, when people talk about hip hop, the complexity therein is just not noted. Not only are we talking about complex production and musical things that are happening, the lyrics themselves, a bit of the lyrics that we just heard, it said, then I had a talk with God. That was interview-esque. He said, Rick, as near as the west and far as the east, there's a warrant for your arrest by the karma police. The dharma was deep. Our daughter was too dark with defeat, but I made it here to tell you the story by the chalk of my teeth. Like there is a lot in there, and I think, when we talk about classical music, when we just use that phrase, we have to, and we can repeat ourselves till we're blue in the face here on this podcast. And if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. We need to actually broaden that definition, especially to include things like hip hop. It hasn't been created or it can't be originated from anywhere but the United States, specifically the Bronx and New York. In 50 years, 49 and a half years as we're taking this, but this summer, in 50 years, it has become not only the predominant musical genre genre of the world, but a broader culture that has impacted so much. How dare we build walls to keep it out of our so-called classical spaces? I hope that we can continue and to normalize that bit of the conversation, because there's a lot. I can't remember if the new Kendrick Lamar album came out this year, if that was 2022, but there's music in there that could very easily, I feel like that album could be performed in a chamber music space. There's just so much of this that we need to continue to repeat and repeat and repeat, just to get that concept normalized in people's minds. Anyway, incredible album. I'm gonna put that record on after we get done recording here in a
Cool.
few minutes. But we're hearing the Trilloquy. This is the final Trilloquy of 2022, and I wanted us to sort of be a little bit reflective about the year. For New Year's Eve, we've all made plans. I guess we're going to be putting on coats and long underwear and stuff, but to go gather around a fire and to write things that we're leaving in 2022, so that we can move forward with as positive, as refreshed as an outlook as possible. I think I still need a little bit of time to figure out what specifically I'm writing on note cards to put into the fire. But I'm curious if there was anything that came top of mind for you when this idea was presented.
So what would I write if I'm trying to be more content with
Mhm.
what I have in my own situation, et cetera, et cetera. So what
So
what
maybe
would I
you write
burn?
so maybe you write complaining on a card
Oh no,
to be burned.
that's not gonna stop. That's not gonna stop. Um, I want to leave behind envy.
Okay. That's a good one.
I want to leave behind jealousy. Yeah. I know I have brown eyes, but a lot of times they can be green.
Okay.
That's what I would leave behind.
I think when I'm thinking about what I'm, so you started with a positive, being more content in the new year. I think one of the things I need to think about for the new year is how to continue the momentum in a different way. So I guess what I'm writing on a note card, at least for now, proverbially speaking, to leave behind are expectations, or my own plans, or
Mhm.
or different things. The nonprofit industrial complex, as it were, has really been challenging me this year, and I really am so grateful for a lot of the positive impact that I've been able to have in the arts, both here on Trilloquy and in my many other things. I want to use my time and my energy in the best way possible. And when I think about the decolonized sort of, train that I'm trying to ride and live through my life, I think I just need to challenge myself to expand that a little bit more, maybe in a way that I wouldn't always have expected, but in a way that can benefit me and benefit other people. For example, what we were talking about earlier today, the idea of starting a work day at noon, and really introducing that, especially in this hybrid office sort of world we live in. I've been thinking about what words maybe do I need to say to my boss at ACO about what it would look like to have at least no meetings before noon, or even the expectation that the work will get done, but we can't always hold traditional office hours, because let's face it, Scott, sometimes I want to get up, and after I do my chanting, maybe it would be great for me to take a walk or get some sort of exercise. Maybe, I would enjoy grabbing a bite to eat at the local diner that closes at 10 a.m. every day, or whenever it closes. And then by the time 11 o'clock or noon rolls around, I'm ready to spend the next, 6, 7, 8 hours really focused on what I'm doing, instead of the first thought when I wake up in the morning being, okay, let me rush and get as much crammed into this hour
Right.
that I have before I have to, jump on the horse for the day. I'm naming that as one example, and maybe I need to think about what needs to go on a note card. Maybe I need to write fear on a note card,
No fear.
or really more specifically, fear of dissonance, or fear of no, or those sorts of things. I think that's what I'm working toward, and what I hope more of us will work toward when we talk about new audiences, new approaches to the arts. I think it's fair to include in that new approaches to the way that we work within the arts. If we can all be happier in in our various corners
Mm.
of this work, maybe that means the work will happen more expediently. Maybe that means the work will happen in a more focused way because we've taken the time to do the other things in our life. I don't know. How have you worked to make your work life balance, your work existence a little, more bearable, considering that it's been a long time since you've done a 9 to 5 thing. You've always been on a less typical work schedule, but what are your words to those of us who are in the 9 to 5, sort of game, working to, convince others that maybe there's a different way that we can go about that aspect of art's work, toward a healthier lifestyle, healthier work-life
Huh.
relationship.
I'm not sure because I feel like I do something work oriented just about every day.
Yeah.
And a lot of the projects that I work on need that daily massaging. They
Mhm.
need that daily contact.
Yeah.
And I take that into account when I'm figuring out my hours for the week. But one of the ways that work from home has been great for me is that if I get into a mode, I'm producing something and I'm in the groove, I can sit there and do 10 hours.
Mhm. Yeah.
And normally I would not be able to sit there and do that. So it's great for that aspect of it. But I guess what I would work on is separating it because the line between my work and my private life is become very blurred.
Yeah. That's a struggle that I've been having as well. There are parts of that I don't mind. For example, we were talking about VJI or seeing me on the sidewalk. That's fine, and if we need to talk about Triloquy or talk about, any other sort of work in that aspect, that's great because that's what I've dedicated my life to. There is something about, letting the emails stack up on this, holiday
Yep.
of ours that
Yep.
gives me a little bit of anxiety, but I've been forcing myself to say no. I even did a few type deletes to today. Like,
Oh.
no, I'm actually gonna, honor taking a little bit of time off. So that maybe that's another thing that I'll write down on a note card and throw into the fire. Unwillingness to stop for a second,
Yep.
to take a break. I don't know. All sorts of things for us to explore. But overall, I think it's been a very cool year. I mean, I got to conduct an opera this year. I've met all sorts of composers that I never thought that I would meet. This podcast of ours is continuing to grow, and I only laugh because whenever there's a mess, people love to tag me or tag the Triloquy account, just to let us know, just in case you didn't see that this is something that's happening. So
Yep.
I'm just very proud of the solid foundation that we've been able to build as a part of the dialogue, a part of the commentary of arts, not only arts change and DEI, but just the arts in general. I think it's really great work that we've done this year, and I'm looking forward to some really great continued rest in this
Do it to it,
week
man.
between Christmas and New Year's. Any parting words before we leave everyone and see them on the other side?
I would point you to the lyrics of Long December and try to, like I do, find the positivity to counterbalance the time when you don't feel the positivity. How about that?
Amen. Yes, with that mud and lotus ratio that we were
Yeah, you
talking about.
said it a little bit better than I did, but thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope y'all have a happy new year. Hope y'all have a continued happy Kwanzaa. And hey, we'll see you next week on the other side.